Now, this entity brings up some interesting questions about mythology in general. At what point does an individual's story or poem become legitimate mythology? What's the difference between fiction and mythological canon? Was every mythological story just one guy making stuff up and it just happened to catch on? Or was it one person writing about something they saw and nobody believed them at first? Well, I don't have any definitive answers for you, but it is interesting food for thought. I'm not going to offer too much of my opinion, but I will always approach with a healthy dose of skepticism. After all, I'm a scientist. Good morning, sunshine. Happy Friday, and welcome back to Tiger's Occult Books and Research. I'm your friendly internet paranormal researcher and investigator, Dr. Morris, and today we're going to take a look into English folklore, and we're going to examine the Asrai. Referring to our main reference text, it doesn't appear in Alias's Encyclopedia of Spirits, but it does appear in Bain's Encyclopedia of Spirits and Ghosts in World Mythology, which leads us down the rabbit hole of the smattering of further research. But I'm still going to tell you where it comes from, how to identify it, what it does, we'll address any ethical concerns, and then we'll make sure we go over safe interaction with the entity if you should ever come across it during your travels. So the origins of this one are actually pretty fascinating. It's unclear if the Asrai even existed in Scottish folklore at all. The first known reference to the Asrai was actually the poem of the same name by Robert Williams Buchanan, published in April of 1872. Now, to be clear, as we've noticed with a lot of entities that we've covered so far, just because we can't find documentation of the entity, that doesn't mean that it never existed in the first place. Oftentimes, a lot of these entities were passed down through oral traditions throughout the generations. However, in this particular instance, I can't seem to find any evidence one way or another about its prior existence in folklore. I can't find anything before Buchanan's poem. However, I can't find any conclusive evidence that Buchanan made it all up on his own. That being said, Robert Edward Frankilian, when he commissioned Buchanan to write a second poem, seemed to be under the impression that the Asrai was actually Buchanan's creation. Likewise, and this actually might be a little bit more damning, controversial British storyteller Ruth Tongue is also involved with this entity. So, Ruth Tongue is a bit of a troublesome person in terms of folklore. According to Dr. Jacqueline Simpson and Dr. Steve Roud's 2003 work, A Dictionary of English Folklore, there's issues with Tongue's authenticity and accuracy. While I am loath to come right out, point a finger, and make the claim, this person's full of it, I can't really in good conscience lean on Tongue's work and remain academically honest to the best of my ability, which is something I personally strive for. Sometimes we're going to get things wrong. It happens. I'm human. I make mistakes. However, Drs. Roud and Simpson commented that Tongue in her work should be viewed as, and I quote, a storyteller reworking fragments of tradition, not as a reliable collector. And when two of the prominent sources, Buchanan and Tongue, are frankly throwing up more red flags than a Chi-Com parade through Tiananmen Square, I can't really justify much of a serious deep dive or inquiry into this entity. That being said, I haven't come across any evidence to conclusively prove that the Asrai isn't a real mythological entity, and one could argue that's the way every mythological entity has come into existence in the first place. As a result, I'm still going to do my job. I'm just going to add the caveats. So let's move into the physical identification methods. On this one, I'm going to lean heavily on a 2023 work titled Melting in the Daylight, The Asrai's Emergence in Modern Myth by Sarah Allison. Now, unfortunately, I don't know anything about that author besides her name. However, the 2-page bibliography in her 12-page paper actually kind of blows Bane's reference work out of the water. And you know how I'm a fan of Bane's reference work. Honestly, the paper is really top-notch. You know what? I'm going to include a link to it if you want to read it. I would strongly recommend it. It's a brilliant read. So with Ms. Allison collating the information for us, she makes it kind of easy to bang out a quick physical description. They're usually depicted as having translucent or pale blue skin, green hair, webbed hands and feet. They have a willowy, delicate build, well suited for underwater life, and are mostly depicted as being rather small, roughly the size of an 11-year-old child, but perfectly proportioned. When we look into the CDI taxonomy, it gets rather interesting. As you know, class 1 through 4 are former humans. The Asrai is decidedly not. Certainly not a class 7 metaspectre. That leaves us with either class 4 class 5 or class 6. Class 5 are your more incorporeal, mostly hostile entities, but Class 6 are your non-human, sometimes corporeal, paranatural entities, and fey creatures like the Asrai fit perfectly into that classification, so we're going to call it a Class 6. Description tells us it's free roaming. It's not particularly tied down to any one location. They tend to swim along the entire river network and deep water lakes, relocating as they please. Identification of the entity tells us it's an aquatic elemental. We'll dig into that and why we think that in just a sec. But until then, the CDI string for an Asrai is a Class 6 free-roaming water elemental. When we look at the tactical threat level, they are a resounding 1. They're shy, timid, gentle, peaceful. They actively avoid contact with humanity. They're also quite fragile too, so they're really not good in a fight. When exposed to sunlight, they melt into a puddle of water. Because sunlight makes them melt into water, and of course they live in the water, that's why we think they're a water elemental. So honestly, Asrai are no threat to humanity at all. Before we get into the folklore, tales, and legends, just a quick reminder, if you'd like to support our documentation of these entities and receive updates on upcoming profiles and topics, please subscribe and click the bell to get notified every time we cover a new entity. I would also like to invite you to join our Discord server to discuss these findings with fellow investigators and other enthusiasts. Getting into the folklore, tales, and legends. Most of the information comes from Buchanan and Tongue. Even leaning on Ms. Allison's work, she's still citing Buchanan and Tongue. I'm not a huge fan of it, but we are just going to have to kind of go with it. I found a copy of the Complete Poetical Works of Robert Buchanan, published in 1901, and it includes both poems featuring the Asrai and The Changeling, A Legend of the Moonlight. The first poem just kind of describes a peaceful, timid, shy underwater civilization. Interestingly, the Asrai are said to be composed of only 3 of the 4 elements: fire, water, and air. And I quote, "Not earth, they were not earthly." The Changeling tells the story of an Asrai mother who wants her baby to have a human soul. So she sends her baby up to take possession of the body of a human infant that had just passed away. In that body, the Asrai plays the role of a human, takes part of the kind of hedonistic corruption available to humanity. He eventually becomes a warrior. He finally repents for his violent and hedonistic ways, becoming an abbot. When he passes away, his spirit actually meets up with his Asrai mother, who has been following him his whole life. However, during his life as a human, he did indeed develop a human soul, so after he passed away, he had to go to the afterlife. Lastly, we've got the story from Tongue that tells the tale of a fisherman who accidentally caught an Asrai in a fishing net. In this story, the Asrai are described as a long-lived race that only ages when they surface in the moonlight, which they do only every century or so. So the fisherman caught the Asrai by accident. The Asrai begged to be freed in an unintelligible language, but the fisherman decided to take the Asrai home so he could show his children and maybe sell it for some cash. When he reached the shoreline at daybreak, however, the Asrai had melted into a puddle of water. However, the fisherman was left with a permanent scar on his arm where the Asrai had touched him as he was hauling her into his boat. The touch is described as cool, but it causes instant frostbite. Now that the legends are out of the way, let's touch on the ethical considerations at play here. The Asrai are shy, timid, fragile. They melt if exposed to the sun. They pose absolutely no threat. Apparently, they can deliver cold burns on contact, but that's if you get close enough to touch them. And they're far more scared of you than you are of them. So no, if you actually see an Asrai, don't mess with the wildlife. Let them be. Actively hunting an Asrai is unethical nonsense and not at all recommended. As for the safe interaction protocols, don't give them a hug or anything. Again, cold burns and all that. If you're fishing and you accidentally catch one, just go ahead and release it. You don't need to be randomly murdering defenseless Asrai. As we've pointed out several times, they're extremely fragile. If you're observing Asrai in any sort of conservationalist or behavioralist manner, you're going to want to go ahead and practice some light discipline. We know moonlight makes them age. Sunlight makes them melt into water, but there's absolutely no data on what an artificial light source would do. LED, incandescent, halogen, etc. I'd advise, as always, analog night vision equipment. Anyway, that's about all the information I was able to dig up about the Asrai. I hope you found it informative. As always, like, comment, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. You can find me on all the regular alt tech sites as well, depending on how tight you've got your tinfoil hat. If you have an entity that you need me to cover, go ahead and join us in the Discord server. Let me know. The link is in the description box down below. Till next time, fellas, I'll see you down here at the lab.